It was the scream that shattered the silence of the afternoon. A raw, panicked sound that didn't just echo through Maplewood Lane, it pierced it. Mr. Harold Minton had always been a fixture in the neighborhood. At 73, he was the man with the newspaper tucked under his arm, the soft shuffle of slippers on concrete, and the slow, careful whistle of jazz standards as he watered his roses. Nobody had ever seen him angry. Nobody had ever seen him afraid. Until today. Harold lay on the sidewalk, crumpled like a forgotten coat, his leg bleeding through the torn fabric of his khakis. A German shepherd, eyes locked, jaws clenched around his calf, growled with a primal, chilling resolve. Holding the leash and not pulling it back stood Officer Darren Blake. He was laughing, not hysterically, not uncontrollably, but deliberately, the corner of his mouth curled with satisfaction, like a man who'd just watched karma deal its hand exactly the way he'd planned. "Call him off," Harold cried out, his voice cracking under the pain. But Darren didn't budge, one hand on the leash, the other resting casually on his holster. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but not his smirk. From across the street, neighbors gasped. Mrs. Green dropped her groceries. A jogger stopped mid-stride, fumbling for his phone. Children, frozen on their bikes, stared in disbelief. This wasn't just shocking, it was wrong. Deeply, viscerally wrong, and it didn't make sense. Not at first. Officer Blake had only been assigned to Maplewood 6 months ago, brought in from a different district after an internal transfer. Quiet, formal, maybe a little too proud of his uniform, but professional. Or so they'd thought. No. One knew of any beef between him and Harold. In fact, few knew much about Darren at all. Except that he walked with authority, rarely made small talk, and kept his distance like he was above everyone on this little suburban lane. So why was his dog, Kilo, a trained police K-9 clamping down on a retired music teacher like he was a fleeing suspect? "Please," Harold's voice cracked again. He tried to pull his leg free, the movement only inciting the dog's bite deeper. Blood now pooled beneath him, a crimson stain on the clean white sidewalk. Darren leaned slightly forward. "Should've stayed quiet, old man." Then came the sirens, another unit responding to the 911 calls. Tires screeched. 2 officers jumped out, shouting commands. In seconds, they yanked Darren back and pried Kilo off Harold's leg. The German shepherd resisted at first, then obeyed only after a sharp command from one of the new arrivals. Harold was unconscious by the time the ambulance arrived. Darren Blake didn't resist arrest. Didn't argue. Just stood there cold and still, as if everything had unfolded exactly how he wanted it to. And for a moment, the neighborhood wasn't sure who the real animal was. Later that evening, behind drawn curtains and hushed voices, everyone asked the same question. Why? What had Harold Minton ever done to deserve that? What they didn't know, what nobody yet knew, was that 28 years earlier a different man had been dragged from a courtroom in handcuffs. A young man who had glared at the judge and pointed at the witness stand where Harold had once sat, calm and certain. And on that day, Darren Blake made a vow. He wouldn't forget. It was 1997. The courtroom smelled like lemon oil and stale sweat. Darren Blake, 17 and scowling, sat at the defense table with a split lip and trembling hands. The judge, gray-bearded and impatient, looked down at him like he was already halfway to prison. And Harold Minton? He sat in the witness box, polished, composed and immaculately dressed in a pressed white shirt and burgundy tie. Harold wasn't just a music teacher that day. He was the key witness. He broke into the back of the school gym, Harold had testified. I saw him through the window from the faculty lounge. He wasn't alone, but he was the one holding the crowbar. Darren never forgot those words. Didn't matter that it was true. Didn't matter that it was his third strike. Harold's words sealed it. 3 years in juvenile detention. 3 long years that started with a cracked gavel and ended with a vow Darren whispered in his cell on his 17th birthday. One day, I'll wear the badge. And when I do, he'll know what it feels like to be powerless. Back in the present, as Harold lay sedated in a hospital bed with bandages wrapped around his leg, the past wasn't just haunting, It was hunting. And Darren Blake had brought it with him. The internal investigation started within hours. The responding officers submitted their body cam footage, and though the audio was garbled by sirens and shouts, one line stood out clear. "Should've stayed quiet, old man. It wasn't an accident, not a misfire, not a dog gone rogue. This was deliberate, premeditated." Detective Lena Brooks, newly promoted and not yet jaded, was assigned to the case. She watched the footage twice. 3 times, each time her stomach knotted tighter. "I need to know who that old man is," she said. Within the hour, Harold's record was on her desk. 35 years as a music teacher. Volunteer work, never married, no children. One name stood out in his early disciplinary reports. Darren Blake, expelled for theft, returned once for a court hearing. Detained. Juvenile time served. Her jaw clenched. Lena drove to the hospital and found Harold awake, barely. His voice was thin, his skin pale, but his eyes were sharp. "Mr. Minton, do you know the officer who did this to you?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't recognize him at first, not until I saw his face when he laughed." She leaned forward. "Why would he do this?" Harold looked away, shame crawling across his features like a slow tide. "Because I told the truth when he couldn't stand to hear it." "Did you know he was an officer now?" "No," Harold said. "I hadn't seen him since the trial." Lena exhaled slowly. The pieces were falling into place, and they painted a picture far darker than she expected. This wasn't a cop losing control. This was a vendetta. A lifetime of grudge, dressed in uniform. Back in her cruiser, Lena sat quietly before starting the engine. On her dash sat a photo of her father, an officer now retired. He used to tell her, "The badge gives you power. It's your job to prove you're worthy of it every damn day." She started the engine. "Darren Blake, you failed that test." Meanwhile, in a holding cell downtown, Darren sat alone, arms crossed, expression flat. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't ask for a phone call. He just stared at the wall like it owed him something. He had waited 28 years for revenge, and in his eyes he'd finally gotten it. But what Darren didn't know, what was coming next, was that his war wasn't over. Because Harold Minton wasn't the only one he'd scarred, and one woman was about to make this very, very personal. Detective Lena Brooks parked outside her mother's nursing home just after sunset. The sky bled purple and orange above the tree line, but her thoughts were fixed elsewhere, on a man with a badge and a grudge, and an old teacher whose blood still stained the sidewalk outside 211 Maplewood Lane. She didn't come to talk to her mother tonight. She came to remember. Inside the small common room, a piano gathered dust in the corner. Years ago, that piano had a nameplate, donated by Mr. Harold Minton. Her mother used to hum along to the music when Harold volunteered here, bringing his records and stories of symphonies and stage lights to a group of fading minds. Lena had first met Harold when she was 12. Her mom was already starting to forget names. One afternoon, she had wandered off while Lena was getting her ice cream. Panic had seized her, pure, uncut fear. She'd searched every hallway screaming until finally, she found her mother sitting quietly on a bench, holding a small bouquet of violets. Next to her sat Harold Minton. "She said you'd come," he had told Lena with a gentle smile. "And I promised her I'd wait with her until you did." Lena never forgot that. Not the man, not the promise, not the kindness when no one else had time to notice. Now that same man had nearly died on a blood-stained sidewalk. And Darren Blake, an officer sworn to protect, had used his dog like a weapon. Not in a moment of panic. In cold calculation, Lena clenched her hands into fists. Back at Precinct HQ, the case file was growing thicker. Complaints about Darren's aggressive conduct, quiet transfers from other departments, a reprimand buried under technicalities. It wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern, one that finally snapped when opportunity met grudge. She returned to the station that night, dragging exhaustion like an anchor. Inside the interrogation room, Darren sat exactly where she left him. Same posture, same silence. She didn't bring a file, didn't bring backup. You waited almost 3 decades, Lena said, stepping into the cold metal room. That takes commitment. Darren glanced at her, saying nothing. You think you won, don't you? Still nothing. She pulled out a chair, flipped it backward, and sat across from him. I met Harold Minton when I was a kid. He once kept my mother company when I thought I lost her forever. I owed him a thank you. Looks like I'll get to repay it in court. At last, Darren spoke. He ruined my life. He told the truth, she said. That truth got me locked up. No, she said, leaning in. You got you locked up. He scoffed. You think you understand? I don't pretend to, Lena said. But I understand what it means to wear a badge. It means your past doesn't get to punish your present. You lost that line a long time ago. He didn't reply, but his jaw tightened, his control slipping. He wasn't proud anymore. He was just exposed. That night, Lena visited Harold at the hospital again. He was awake, but still weak. He hated me, Harold whispered, his voice thin. All these years, and I never even remembered his face. You remembered his actions, she said gently. That's what mattered. Tears welled in Harold's eyes. I only did what was right. You did. Lena nodded. And I will too. Outside his room, she made a quiet call to internal affairs. I'm pushing for a full badge review, she told them. Not just Darren. Every officer he's trained, every case he's touched. He used his badge for revenge. I won't let him stain the rest of us. What started as a dog attack was unraveling into a legacy of abuse, all stemming from a wound that had never truly healed. But now Lena was going to cauterize it, for Harold, for justice, and for the little girl who'd once promised herself she would grow up to protect people the way Harold had protected her. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall with their notepads and long lenses. Neighbors from Maplewood Lane whispered in the gallery. Even off-duty officers came, not in support of Darren Blake, but to see how far the badge had fallen. At the center of it all sat Harold Minton in a wheelchair, his bandaged leg propped on a small cushion, a quiet dignity clinging to him like an old suit. He wore a navy sweater and a burgundy tie, the same color he wore the day he testified all those years ago. Detective Lena Brooks sat beside the prosecutor, her notes neatly stacked, but untouched. She didn't need paper to remember what was at stake. She carried it in her gut. Darren Blake entered through the side door in an orange jumpsuit, flanked by 2 guards. His once proud posture now had a slump in the shoulders. His eyes scanned, the room locking briefly with Harold's, but Harold didn't flinch. He simply stared back, steady, calm. The prosecutor rose. This isn't just about a dog attack. It's about a betrayal of public trust, about an officer who weaponized his position to settle a decades-old score against a man who told the truth. The defense objected. Speculation. No evidence of intent. But Lena knew they had the evidence. Body cam footage, internal memos, testimonies from Darren's former colleagues, and most importantly, Harold's calm, unwavering voice. When Harold was wheeled to the front, silence fell. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the jury. I didn't even remember his face, he said softly. I remembered his actions. That's what I testified to. I was a teacher. I believed in second chances. But this, what happened to me, it wasn't about justice. It was about vengeance. He took a slow breath. I taught music for 35 years. I believed harmony could be found even in the harshest notes. But Officer Blake, he didn't want harmony. He wanted silence. My silence. The courtroom held its breath. Then came the video. Darren's voice, clear on the body cam footage. Should have stayed quiet, old man. There was no mistaking it now. No pretending it had been a mistake. No hiding behind protocol or the heat of the moment. Next came a former officer from Darren's old precinct. She testified about his temper. About the time he sent a rookie to the ER during a training drill. About the informal nickname he'd earned in the locker room, Judge Dredd. Lena watched Darren's expression shift with every word. Defiance turned to discomfort. The walls were closing in, and he knew. And when it was her turn on the stand, Lena spoke plainly. He waited almost 30 years to get revenge, she told the court. And the moment he was given a leash, he used it. Then she looked directly at Darren. But that leash goes both ways. The defense tried to spin a last-minute argument. Childhood trauma, unresolved anger, claims of mental stress from years on the force. But it didn't matter. The jury didn't see a broken man. They saw a dangerous one. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty of felony assault, abuse of power, and intentional misuse of a law enforcement animal. The sentence would come later, but the message was immediate and unmistakable. The badge didn't make you untouchable, it made you accountable. As the courtroom emptied, Lena stood beside Harold. He looked tired, but lighter. "You didn't have to do all this," he murmured. "Yes, I did," she replied. "Because when I was 12, you waited with my mother until I came back. I never forgot that." Harold's eyes glistened. "I remember now. Her name was Marie." Lena nodded. "She passed last year, but she always remembered the man with the violets." They stood in quiet understanding. The gavel fell one last time that day, but the real judgment had come long before. In every action, every choice, every moment where justice could have been served or denied. This time, it had been served. The courthouse steps were lined with news vans, microphones, and flashing cameras. But Harold Minton didn't stop for interviews. He let his wheelchair roll gently down the ramp, pushed by Lena Brooks, both of them silent as the clamor faded behind them. His eyes weren't on the crowd, or the headlines. They were on the pigeons across the street, pecking at crumbs beside a worn park bench. Life was still moving, quietly, unchanged, yet inside him, something had shifted. Lena helped him into her unmarked cruiser. The door closed with a soft thump, sealing the world out for a moment. She glanced over. "How's the leg?" Harold gave a thin smile. "Hurts less than my pride did." She nodded. "That'll heal too?" He looked at her. "You think he regrets it?" She paused, then shook her head. Darren Blake didn't just carry a grudge, he fed it. Every day. He nurtured it until it was stronger than his oath. Harold exhaled. "And now it's in a cage." They didn't speak for the rest of the drive. Just the rhythm of the engine, the turning wheels, the quiet after a storm that had raged for decades. Back at the station, Lena returned to her desk to find 2 notes on top of her keyboard. One was a commendation slip from the chief. Official praise for her dedication to justice in the face of internal corruption. Polite, sterile, and impersonal. The other was a handwritten letter. She unfolded it. "Detective Brooks, I resigned today. I should have come forward about Darren years ago, but I was scared. I let the uniform blind me to the man behind it. What you did, it reminded me why I joined the force in the first place. I hope someday I'm worthy of this badge again. Officer M. Reyes." Lena closed her eyes. Consequences didn't stop at a guilty verdict. They rippled. Through policies, partners, precincts, through people who'd looked the other way for too long. Later that evening, she visited Harold at his home. His modest apartment smelled faintly of cedar and worn books. Music sheets lay across the piano bench, though he hadn't played in years. She brought tea. He brought silence. After a while, he spoke. "Do you think I could have done something different back then with Darren?" Lena sat across from him. "You told the truth. I was his teacher. I was supposed to see past his mistakes. You did. But sometimes seeing someone clearly means admitting they're walking a road you can't pull them back from." Harold nodded slowly. "And now I have to live with the idea that maybe, for 30 years, I was someone's villain. You weren't," she said firmly. "He made you one in his story because it was easier than taking responsibility in his own." Harold looked down at his bandaged leg. "Then why doesn't it feel like I won?" Because justice doesn't feel like victory, she said. It feels like survival. The next morning, Lena stood outside a classroom at Eastwood Elementary. A counselor had invited her to speak to a group of fifth graders about good cops and hard choices. She hesitated in the doorway. The children looked up, wide-eyed, notebooks in hand. One girl raised her hand before Lena could even speak. "Are you the one who caught the bad officer?" Lena smiled gently. "No," she said. "I'm the one who didn't let the good people get forgotten." As she began to speak, somewhere across the city, Darren Blake stared at a concrete wall. In a prison cell. No badge. No dog. Just silence. And in a quiet living room with a piano that hadn't sung in years, Harold Minton laid his fingers on the keys and played the first chord of a song he thought he'd never touch again. Harold's fingers trembled. Over the keys. The piano was out of tune. A few notes clinked like old bones. But the melody still lived, buried under dust and years, waiting to rise again. He played slowly, carefully, as if each note was a breath he hadn't dared to take. Until now, the sunlight streamed through the window in golden sheets. It fell across the wrinkled music sheets beside him, his original compositions, the ones he never shared, not even with his students. Not because he was shy, but because he wasn't sure they mattered. Today, they did. Across the city, Lena Brooks sat quietly at her mother's gravesite, a modest plaque, a cluster of fresh violets in her hand. "You remembered him," she whispered, "even when you forgot me sometimes. You remembered him." She brushed a leaf from the marble and exhaled. The storm had passed, but she carried the scars in her ribs, where anger once burned and justice had to claw its way through concrete. Silence. As she stood, her phone buzzed, a voicemail from Harold. "I just finished the last page of the piece I wrote for Marie. Thought you should hear it. It's not perfect, but maybe that's the point. We do the best we can, and hope someone listens." Lena smiled. Later that week, the city held a small memorial at Harold's old school, an unofficial celebration of a man who never asked for a spotlight. Parents brought flowers, former students brought stories. A choir of teenagers sang a choral arrangement of one of Harold's pieces. He sat quietly near the front, eyes closed, letting the music lift and fall like a tide on familiar shores. When the song ended, the room stood in quiet applause, and then the principal stepped forward. "We've decided to rename our music hall," she said, voice trembling slightly. "From this day forward, it will be known as the Harold Minton Center for Harmony." The crowd erupted in standing ovation. But Harold simply bowed his head, humbled. He didn't need the honor. He already had what mattered: peace. Lena stood beside him, her badge polished, her eyes glassy. "You finally got your harmony," she said. Harold chuckled. "Took long enough. But it came," she said. "Because you never stopped doing the right thing. And you never stopped chasing truth," he replied. Even when it bit. They walked outside together, past the brass plaque with his name, past the students chatting in bright spring light. Somewhere nearby, a child practiced piano through an open window. The tune was halting, unsure, but growing stronger. Later, that night, Lena sat at her kitchen table, flipping through her mother's old journal. Most pages were scribbled with fading thoughts, half memories, fragments, but one page stood out. "The man with the violets is kind. He reminds me of songs I've forgotten." Lena closed the journal slowly, heart full. Some stories aren't about winning or losing, they're about remembering, about holding on to the people who shaped us, even when the world tries to bury them under fear, bureaucracy, or time. In the end, Harold Minton wasn't just a victim of a dog attack. He was a teacher, a guardian of dignity, a quiet force who unknowingly saved a child's mother and decades later inspired that same child, grown into a detective, to save him right. Back in the dog? It was taken in by a rehabilitation program for former K-9 units, trained to work with disabled veterans. No longer a weapon, but a companion with a second chance. just like the people it left behind, and in a modest apartment, beneath the hush of dusk and the weight of years, Harold sat at his piano and played a soft, wandering melody. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and it was finally heard.